Journalists who interviewed John Lennon across 40 years of public life describe a consistent experience: the feeling of sitting across from someone who was, simultaneously, entirely present and entirely defended. He was warm, he was funny. He was occasionally brilliant in ways that made you forget you had questions prepared, that pulled the conversation somewhere more interesting than any question could have anticipated. But there was a quality beneath all of that, a specific, finely maintained distance between the person in the room and the person answering the questions, that even the most skilled interviewers found difficult to breach. He had learned, very young and under conditions of extreme scrutiny, how to give an interview, how to satisfy the professional requirements of a press interaction while keeping the interior self intact, unreached. Present in the room but not on the record, he was brilliant at this. The interviews from the Beatlemania years, the press conferences in airports and hotel ballrooms, the radio sessions, the television appearances are masterclasses in the management of public attention. He gave the cameras what they needed and kept what mattered. That was the arrangement, and he maintained it for most of his life with a discipline that looked, from the outside, like effortless openness. And then in November of 1980, during a series of interviews for the release of Double Fantasy, a journalist asked him a question that the arrangement could not contain. The question was not unusual. It was not provocative in the obvious sense. It was the kind of question that any good interviewer might ask, the kind that seems simple on its surface and is, underneath, the most direct possible path to the thing that has been carefully not discussed. John Lennon answered it, and somewhere in the middle of answering, not at the beginning, not at the obvious emotional peak of the subject, but midway through, in a place no one could have predicted, his face changed. His voice changed, and for a moment that the interviewer described as one of the most unexpected things they had ever witnessed in 40 years of journalism, John Lennon was not managing anything. But to understand what happened in that room in November 1980, you have to understand what it had cost him to manage it for so long. The defenses had been built early and for good reason. John Lennon grew up in circumstances that required a specific kind of emotional self-sufficiency, the kind that develops in children who learn young that the adults in their lives cannot be entirely relied upon, that the safest place to keep the things that matter most is inside, where they cannot be reached by the instability of the surrounding world. His father Alfred had left when he was 5. His mother Julia had been warm and present in her intermittent way, visits, music, laughter, and then was killed by a car when John was 17. Aunt Mimi had raised him with genuine love and genuine distance, a combination that produced, in John, a person who was capable of deep attachment and constitutionally suspicious of its reliability. The losses had not been processed in any clean or linear way. They had gone underground, as deep losses do, and become part of the architecture of the person who grew around them, shaping his humor, his defenses, his specific way of being in a room with other people. The quickness, the deflection, the ability to fill any conversational space with something interesting before anyone could reach for the thing underneath, all of it traced back in some form to the 17-year-old who had picked up a guitar after his mother died and discovered that music was the one language that could carry what ordinary words could not reach. He had brought this to the Beatles, to the fame, to the decades of public life that followed. The wit was real, but it was also armor. The provocations were genuine, but they also kept people at a useful distance, people who were too busy laughing or arguing with what he had just said to look at what was underneath it. The confessional songs, the ones on Plastic Ono Band, the ones on Imagine, the ones that seemed to say more than any person should say in public, were honest, genuinely honest, but they were also mediated. Had been processed through the craft of songwriting, shaped and structured and arranged, given a melody that made them receivable. The pain was real, and the form protected both John and the listener from the full weight of its rawness. An interview had none of these protections. An interview was a conversation, contingent, unscripted, moving at the pace of another person's curiosity rather than at the pace of John's considered presentation of himself. The best interviews he had given across his career were ones where he had managed, through skill and speed and the sheer force of a personality that could fill any room it entered, to shape the conversation toward what he was willing to discuss. The ones that had reached something real, the David Sheff interview of 1980 being the most significant, had done so gradually, accumulating trust across hours of Conversation until the guard had come down, not by being overcome, but by becoming unnecessary. The November 1980 interviews were given in the context of Double Fantasy's release, and John approached them with a quality of openness that surprised the journalists involved. He had been away for 5 years. The album was genuine, made from a real place, not from a strategic one, and he was willing to talk about it honestly. But the openness had a character to it that was different from the openness of the earlier career. It was not the performed openness of someone giving a press conference or managing an image. It was the specific openness of someone who had spent 5 years finding out who they were without an audience, and had arrived at a place of sufficient self-knowledge that the usual reasons for concealment had somewhat lost their force. He was 40 years old. He had been famous for half his life. He had made music that would outlast every other artifact of its era, had taken political positions that had cost him something real, had loved and lost and chosen again. He had raised a child in deliberate proximity to ordinary life. He had, in the 5 years of the domestic period, lived more completely inside himself than at any previous point in his adult life, and what he had found there was not the frightening void that the fear of stopping had always implied. It was a person he recognized, a person he was, with some qualification and in some moments more than others, at peace with. This peace, imperfect, provisional, real, is what made the interview different, because peace lowers the guard. Not all the way and not permanently, but enough, the journalist who asked the question. That broke through has been described, in various accounts of the 1980 interview period, as skilled and methodical, someone who understood that the way to reach John Lennon was not through provocation or surprise, but through patience, through the slow accumulation of a conversational trust that eventually made the defenses feel unnecessary rather than overcome. The early part of the interview was warm and wide-ranging, double fantasy. The 5 years at home, Sean, New York, music as a practice versus music as a career. John answered fluently and with the specific quality of someone who had recently decided they were willing to be more honest than usual, and was discovering in the act of being more honest that it was not as costly as they had expected. And then the journalist asked about Julian. Julian Lennon was 16 years old in 1980, the son of John's first marriage to Cynthia Powell. He had grown up largely without his father, not in the absolute sense, not entirely, but in the substantial sense of a boy who had spent his childhood knowing that his father was one of the most famous people in the world, and that this fact made him, paradoxically, less rather than more present in Julian's life. The Beatles' years had demanded everything. The subsequent years of political activism and artistic experimentation and the turbulent navigation of the post-Beatles identity had demanded almost everything that remained. Julian had grown up in the margins of a life that was too large and too consuming to have much margin left. John knew this. He had always known it, in the way that people know the things they cannot face directly, holding the knowledge at a slight angle to the conscious mind, neither fully confronting it nor fully evading it. The domestic years with Sean had been, among other things, a sustained encounter with what he had not given Julian, a daily reminder in the form of what he was now doing, of what he had previously not done. He had not spoken about this in interviews. It was, of all the territories of his interior life, the one most carefully protected. The journalist asked the question simply and without preamble, something about Julian. Something about the distance and what John thought about it now, looking back, with Sean beside him as a daily reality. The exact words have been reported differently by different sources, which suggests that what was said was less important than what it reached. It was, in whatever form it took, a question that went directly to the thing John had been carrying and had not carried into a room with a journalist. Before, he began to answer in the way he usually answered difficult questions, with a kind of considered framing, a thoughtful preface that established the complexity of the subject before entering it. He spoke about the circumstances of the Beatles' years, about how much of himself the music had demanded, about the way that fame at that scale creates a kind of personal scarcity. There is only so much of a person to distribute, and when the public claim is as enormous as the public claim on John Lennon had been, the private claim suffers. He was articulate. He was honest within the frame he had built. And then something happened that the frame could not contain. He was speaking about Julian, about a specific memory, a specific moment, something small and domestic from Julian's childhood that John had not been present for and had learned about secondhand. The way absent parents learn about their children's lives, and his voice changed, not dramatically, not with the audible crack of performed emotion, but in the specific, involuntary way that voices change when the person speaking has arrived somewhere they did not intend to go, somewhere the management cannot follow. He stopped for a moment, just a moment, a pause that was barely noticeable in duration and entirely noticeable in quality. In that pause the journalist who was present has described, John Lennon's face did something that they had never seen it do in any previous interview they had conducted or witnessed. The wit was gone, the management was gone, the specific, practiced quality of being John Lennon in a room with a journalist was simply gone. What remained was a man who had just, in the act of trying to speak honestly about one subject, arrived unexpectedly at a different and more painful one. The distance from a child, the years that could not be reclaimed, the daily reminder of what had been given and what had not. He did not weep. This is important to note, because the account of this moment has sometimes been simplified in retrospect into something more dramatic than what actually occurred. He did not cry in the way that would have been easy to describe and easy to understand. What happened was quieter and more private than that. His eyes filled. His jaw was briefly, just briefly, not set in the way it was almost always set in public. His voice, when it came back, was different from what it had been before the pause, lower, more careful, carrying something that the previous voice had not been carrying. What was in the voice and what was in the expression was not grief in the acute sense, not the immediate weight of fresh loss. It was something more specific and in its own way more difficult, the grief of having understood something too late to change it, of being a man who was, in the present, doing a thing he had not done in the past and knowing with full clarity what that difference meant. Every morning he spent with Sean in the Dakota kitchen was also, implicitly, a knowledge of what Julian's mornings had not contained, not through malice, not through indifference exactly, through the particular blindness of someone whose life had claimed everything he had, leaving nothing for the margins until the margins were where a child grew up. He said something about time, about the impossibility of going back, about Sean being a gift that was also, in some specific and difficult way, a measure of what Julian had not received. He did not frame it as guilt. John Lennon did not easily use the language of guilt about himself, which was itself a form of protection. He framed it as fact, a thing that was true and could not be made untrue and had to be lived with rather than resolved. The journalist did not press further. They understood, with the instinct that distinguishes good interviewers from merely competent ones, that what had just happened was complete, that pressing further would have been a violation rather than a deepening, that the moment required the same quality of respectful stillness that it had been given in the room. They moved on to another subject. John regathered himself with the speed of someone who has long practice at regathering, who has been managing himself in public since he was 22, and knows how to return from an unintended place to the conversation that is expected. But the journalist noticed something that they later described as one of the most significant things they observed across the entire interview. After the return, after the management had reasserted itself, and John was again articulate and warm and the practiced version of himself, there was a quality in his eyes that had not been there before the question about Julian, a different kind of presence. As if having been briefly reached in that specific place had left something open that the management could close over but not entirely seal. The interview ended warmly. John was gracious. He gave the journalist what they needed for the piece. He shook hands at the door of the room and returned to the elevator and the lobby and the New York street outside and the life that was waiting for him, the album, the promotion, the return to the public world after 5 years of privacy, the schedule of appearances that the record label had arranged. He was shot and killed 3 weeks later. The interview was published. The moment about Julian, described by the journalist with the careful restraint that the moment had been given in the room, was part of the published piece, treated with the same restraint in print that it had been given in person. It did not become the focus of the coverage. Double Fantasy was the story, and John's return from 5 years of silence was the story, and the warmth and reflectiveness of the 1980 interviews as a whole was the story. The Julian moment was a paragraph, and then it was part of the record. But for the journalist who had been in the room, who had asked the question without knowing where it would go, who had witnessed the 3 or 4 seconds, in which John Lennon's face had done something his face almost never did in public. The moment remained more significant than anything else in the interview, more significant, perhaps, than anything in 40 years of sitting across from famous people and asking them questions, because what they had witnessed was not a breakdown. It was not a revelation in the dramatic sense. It was something more rare and more human than either. It was the moment when a person who has spent a lifetime being very skilled at being themselves in public was, briefly and against their own management, simply themselves, without the skill, without the management, in the middle of a sentence about a boy he had not been present enough for, holding the weight of that fact without the usual structures that made it holdable. John Lennon gave thousands of interviews. He was brilliant. In many of them, he was honest by his own lights in most of them. But in that room in November 1980, he gave something rarer than honesty. He gave, for those few seconds, the version of himself that the interviews had always been protecting against. And the journalist who received it understood, sitting across the table, that they were in the presence of something that had nothing to do with journalism. It had to do with a father and a son, and the years between them, and the specific weight of what cannot be undone.